Maybe I should explain how a theoretical physicist became a sort of a radical scientist and a radical interdisciplinary person. I did my PhD on the conditions in the centre of the sun, absolutely removed from all earthly considerations. And it was quite, I found it was very difficult mathematics. And after my PhD, I visited a scientist who was an expert in the field, and I was on my way to take up a job in Britain. And this scientist was at the University of California, Berkeley, and he also worked at another place called Livermore National Laboratory. Anyway, I arrived at his lab, and he said, "Oh, congratulations on your thesis, Mark. My colleagues at Livermore are using it to improve their design of the hydrogen bomb." You can imagine that was a big shock, and it determined my future direction of research. I didn't want to work for the military. I didn't want to work for large corporations with enormous power. So it's been quite a difficult career path, actually. But I have worked on and off on renewable energy since about 1978, when I was a very young scientist, and gradually broadened out. Because initially I thought that all we needed was technical solutions. And as you will see, I came to realise that technology is incredibly important, but without social change and economic change, we're not going to be able to get there in time. So that's the problem. So in this talk, I'll give a kind of an introduction to the book. And basically, the main theme of the book is to say, look, environmental destruction, social inequality, war, public ill health, these issues are all related, and in fact, they have common barriers. So I'll explain how I see the principal barriers. There are many barriers to a better society, a better civilization. The barriers to stop the slow collapse of the present civilization, which we are currently, I believe, experiencing. So I'll bring forward the barriers and some practical ways of how we can actually tackle them, and what I think we have to do. Okay, so you all know about climate change. You've experienced it here in the Blue Mountains, as the Mayor has said. It's an existential threat to human civilization, as well as a very serious threat here in the Blue Mountains. I believe that it is possible, let me rephrase that, it may be possible to halt climate change, human-induced climate change, but it's very difficult and time is running out. So that's one of our existential threats. But in the environmental area, Earth system scientists have already identified 6 what they call planetary boundaries that have already been crossed. The idea of a planetary boundary is that if you exceed that boundary, you're in a situation which is not sustainable for the future of the world. Well, climate change up here, if you're into the red or the orange, you're out of the safe zone. And climate change, obviously, is one area where we've exceeded planetary boundaries. Biodiversity loss is another. Land system change, so deforestation, destruction of soils, novel entities. It sort of covers a mishmash. Plastics in the ocean, environmental chemicals, and so on. Biochemical flows. So we are totally dependent on the natural biogeochemical flows of nature, the carbon cycle, obviously, the oxygen cycle, phosphorus, nitrogen, and so on. And we are in a bad way. Phosphorus and nitrogen are essential elements in our DNA, literally, and in the DNA of all living things. And we're basically dumping them into the ocean, where it is going to be extremely difficult to remove them. So ocean acidification hasn't quite got out of the safe zone, but it is going there. So on the environmental side, we've already changed the system. The geological system used to be called the Holocene, the system in which humans emerged. But we are so dominating it that some people are suggesting that we rename it as the Anthropocene. And Glenn Elbricht, at the last presentation, also had his own take on an approach. And I'm not quite... Symbiocene. Symbiocene. Got it. Okay, sorry about that. Another existential threat to human civilization, obviously, is nuclear war. And the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has advanced the hands of the doomsday plot to 90 seconds to midnight, which is the closest to catastrophic end to human civilization that it's ever been. It's debatable. I think we got pretty close to that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was actually saved largely by Gorbachev. But anyway, we are now faced with possible nuclear war between the United States and Russia, or the United States and China. And we're really getting into a very dangerous situation there. And I'm going to suggest that we can push the hands of the doomsday clock back a little bit, but we can't totally, obviously, solve the problem of war. Social inequality, poverty and social inequality, both within countries, even within countries like Australia, and between countries, is a major issue. And yet, we have the resources to solve these problems, given the political will, and that's the problem. Another issue that's closely related to all these issues is the question of how we are governed. Do we stick with a democratic system, or do we allow our system to become more autocratic? And I would say that right now, even in Australia, we are seeing incredible legislation, federal in terms of so-called anti-terrorist legislation that can be applied to anyone, and within the states. And I just noted that in New South Wales now, there are penalties of $22,000 or 2 years in jail for illegal protests that disrupt economic activity. In South Australia, for obstructing a public place, legally one could be up for a $50,000 fine or 3 months in jail. That's just a small sample. So the solutions I'm going to propose are solutions for moving to a more democratic system with more just laws. Now, the point I want to make about listing these threats is that they are connected. Rich individuals and rich countries actually have the biggest environmental impacts, by far, whether you're looking at greenhouse gas emissions or you're looking at a whole range of environmental impacts. There have been numerous studies now published in world-leading journals like Nature, which show that rich individuals and rich countries often have environmental impacts from 10 to 100 times that of the average impact in the world. Environmental impacts are worse for the poor, and extreme social inequality often results from autocracy, or democracy gradually becoming more autocratic. The dominant economic system that we have, I would assert, is based on the exploitation of the planet and its peoples and all its inhabitants. And it's one of the main driving forces, in my view, of environmental destruction and social injustice. So we have to look at that. War, of course, has huge environmental and social impacts, and we have to start talking about war. And in Australia, the decision to go to war is not democratic. The Prime Minister has total power to take us all to war if he decides, or she, without any discussion in Parliament. And that's what's happened many times in the past, as we've followed the United States into a whole series of destructive and pointless wars. Now, so what we're looking for are solution strategies that can tackle all the main threats together: environmental, social inequality, war, public health, injustice, whatever. Now, I'm not talking about creating a utopia. I don't believe in utopias. And I think we're heading for a dystopia. But I think we can do a lot better than we're doing at present. And it isn't that difficult technically, but politically it is difficult. And so, okay, so let's take this a bit further. I'm going to argue that one of the main barriers, or one of the main driving forces for environmental destruction and social injustice is the capture of nation states by very powerful vested interests. Some of them are corporate interests. We all know about the fossil fuel industry, but we could also talk about the pharmaceutical industry, the military, the armaments industry, the financial services industry, in other words, banks and so on, and the gambling industry. Well, actually, that's mostly the financial services industry, isn't it? And so, by capture, I don't mean just minor corruption, where some industry pays a politician off or something. We're talking about a whole nation state largely being captured. The government, the opposition, the public service, sometimes the military and the police, and by vested interests. And in many cases they are corporate, very large corporations, but they could also be religious organisations. They can be, some professions are very, very powerful politically. Captors can include foreign governments, and I'll have more to say about that. And obviously the capture of nation states by vested interests is anti-democratic. So if we believe in democracy, then we have to try and address this problem. And, well, stating the obvious, state capture can lead and does lead to environmental destruction, social injustice, war, and so on. Okay, so I hardly need to say much about the fossil fuel industry. In fact, that picture, which is two of our politicians worshipping a lump of coal in Parliament House, really says it all. There's a certain irony. The Minerals Council of Australia, which supplied the lump of coal, painted it with lacquer so that the politicians wouldn't get their hands dirty. Now, we've had retiring ministers of energy or resources from both our major political parties, upon retirement almost immediately taking up much higher paid jobs in the industries that they were responsible for as ministers. I won't actually name them tonight, it's probably unnecessary. The Chief of Staff of our previous Prime Minister came directly, he was the Deputy Director of the Minerals Council of Australia. So that's what we call revolving door jobs. So we get people from industry giving advice to governments, and we also get ministers from government, the door rotates in the other direction as well, going back and getting very highly paid jobs in the industries. We've also seen the control of a large fraction of our media by News Corp, basically. And the control has been so extreme that one of the members of the family that owns News Corp, James Murdoch, actually publicly criticised the situation with regard to News Corp's misrepresentation of climate issues. So that's where we're at. Now, what about the military? What about the military? If you watch TV commentary and radio commentary, you'll often hear on the ABC, on our ABC, an expert, so-called expert organisation giving their views, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. This institute is funded by the US and Australian governments and the armaments industry. It is not an objective source of information, but it plays a very important role in government decisions on foreign affairs and defence. A former Defence Minister in the Australian government, upon retirement, was appointed to a senior position in one of the armaments industries. In fact, Boeing, which doesn't just make jet aircraft, but makes weapons. Now, what about the AUKUS agreement? Australia, United Kingdom, United States. Before the decision was announced that Australia and the US and the UK would form this AUKUS organisation, and Australia would cancel its order for diesel-powered submarines, which are highly suitable for patrolling our coastline, and replace that with nuclear-powered submarines, which are highly suitable for action at a distance from Australia, for example, in the South China Sea. Before that decision was made, the Australian Defence Department employed 5 retired US admirals, 5 admirals, to advise the Defence Department on future purchases of naval ships. We have to thank the investigative reporters of the Washington Post for revealing this. So there's still some investigative journalists out there, which is fantastic. So they were paid consultants, paid by us. And if you believe in the current theory of money, they were paid by you through your taxes. But in fact, I would stand aside from that. There is an even more important agreement that gets very little publicity in Australia called the Force Posture Agreement. It's an agreement between Australia and the United States, and it has resulted in the expansion of the Tyndall Air Force Base near Darwin to take B-52 bombers, which may or may not be carrying nuclear weapons. It's resulted in expansion of Australian naval facilities to take visiting US military ships which may or may not be carrying nuclear weapons. So it seems to me that on the basis of that evidence alone, and there's a lot more, that the Australian state has been captured by the US military-industrial complex. And for that phrase, we have to thank the former President Dwight D. Eisenhower of the United States, who, upon retiring, expressed his concern at that time of the growing power of this military-industrial complex, which of course has become far more powerful. And of course, this close relationship, which is now even closer with the US, is in great danger of dragging us into a war with China. And there's really been very little parliamentary or public debate, apart from issues raised by the Greens, about whether that's where we really want to go. There's been very little public debate about whether we want offensive weapons that are designed apparently to try and contain China, which I think is an impossible task, but anyway, or whether we move towards a defensive defence system. Okay, but it gets worse. We now have neo-colonialism. Colonialism is almost gone. Not quite, actually. But neo-colonialism still involves in capturing the global south by the global north. And it's captured by sovereign debt, by lending very large amounts of money, either by individual countries or by international banks like the IMF and so on. It's captured by trade, which keeps low-income countries, poor countries, as quarries for the rest of the world. Now, actually, Australia's somewhat in that situation as well, and that's been, I remember as a teenager reading a book called Quarry Australia. The issue's been there for a long time. Some studies suggest that in debates about foreign aid, that actually there is a net flow of wealth from the global south, the poor countries, to the global north, the rich countries. And that case is now being argued very seriously in the literature. And neocolonialism is also implemented by coups, subversion, and military attacks by countries of the global north on the global south. The removal of governments. And when you actually look at the situation, one has to say that one country has really been the champion at doing that. And it has been almost in continuous war since the end of World War II. And that is our greatest ally. So we need to think about how close we want to get to a country that does that, that has an assassination squad, that sometimes succeeds in assassinating politicians in other countries, that they don't think will do the right thing. Now you might think that that is a very extreme statement. It's very well documented in congressional reports and so on. And that reminds me, talking about neocolonialism reminds me that I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, their elders, pay my respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge that their land has been taken away by guns, germs and steel. And upon reflection, that land grabbing is still going on in a number of places around the world. Only the steel is being replaced by bombs and missiles. Okay, and now we come to the other part of state capture, the capture of the whole state and often whole nations by an economic system that, as I said, is based on exploiting the planet and exploiting individuals. And I've been very interested in economics even when I was studying theoretical physics, because my professor at the University of New South Wales, when I was doing a PhD, John Blatt, he was a brilliant, he almost got the Nobel Prize for his work on the theory of superconductivity, but his paper just came out a little bit too late. But he also looked at economic systems. He was a brilliant applied mathematician and physicist, and that's what got me interested. And so I kept trying to understand conventional economics over the decades and could never make sense of it. But now things are gradually at last becoming clearer, and looking at it as a scientist. But you don't have to be a scientist to understand three of the main problems with conventional economics. And the first one is there, endless growth in consumption, and I'm talking about consumption of energy and materials and land, and also endless growth in population. Endless growth on a finite planet the notion is that it's feasible and it's desirable. And this has been, it's gone right through the whole community. Nobody except good people like you are here would dream of questioning it, but if you look at the media, the news, the ABC, and our politicians, of course, it's all about economic growth. And economic growth is very closely tied to physical growth. It's coupled. Now, you know, if we replace fossil fuels with renewable energy, that's fantastic. It reduces pollution dramatically. But if the energy system based on renewables continues to grow, then the wheels of industry and the wheels of transport turn faster and faster, and you still get environmental impacts, quite substantial ones. You just don't get the carbon dioxide impacts. So this ideology has no basis in economic theory that I can find, in real, intelligent, sensible, scientific economic theory. The reality is that we humans are totally dependent on all those natural systems, all that green stuff out there. People who are brought up in cities just don't realise that our existence relies on nature continuing. The other encouraging thing is that beyond a certain level of consumption, there have been numerous studies done to show that people don't get any happier. And if you measure well-being, not by GDP, but by a whole range of indicators, better health, jobs, housing, and so on, you find that well-being also doesn't depend on continuing economic growth beyond a certain level. For low-income countries, further economic growth is often essential. And the other problem with continuing economic growth in the rich countries is that if consumption continues to grow, it delays the substitution of green technologies for dirty technologies. And I'll show you in this picture. This is the total global energy consumption in 2009. 80% of it was fossil fuels. 10 years later, when renewable energy grew at an enormous pace, renewable energy has been incredibly successful. Fossil fuels are still 80% of total energy consumption on the planet. How is this possible? It's possible because of the growth in consumption. The growth in consumption, in absolute terms, is outstripping even the growth in renewable energy. Renewable energy is growing much faster in percentage terms. But because it started from a small base, in absolute terms, up to 2019, it wasn't catching up. It has had an additional growth spurt since 2019, but we still have this problem of increasing consumption. And I tend to think of it, when I was a young person, a student, I used to run the 800 metres. And I can just picture coming into the finishing straight and seeing the officials running away with the finishing tape. Now, I was an arrogant young guy, and I knew I'd catch them in the end, but by that time I wasn't going to break any records, that's for sure. And that's the problem, that we're chasing a retreating target with increasing consumption. So we have to confront that. So that's the first concern about the economic system. I'll skip this slide, and maybe I should skip this one. This is bad news. I should explain that you would think this would be obvious to climate scientists and to others who do. And when you look at the IPCC reports, they do climate scenarios in which somehow we go to net zero emissions. Well, it used to be by 2050, and now it's more like 2100. And how do we get to that? They get to it by assuming the capture of carbon dioxide, either from the chimneys of power stations or from extracting it from the atmosphere. Now, the problem with that is, and they really, just about every model that's in the IPCC or the International Energy Agency has carbon dioxide removal as an important part of it. And yet we do not have technologies that can do it on a large scale at a reasonable price, at reasonable energy inputs. So it's a terrific gamble, and the only way we can really extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is by planting lots of trees, which is a good thing if we don't plant monocultures. But you would need a vast area planted, like half of Western Australia, just to make a significant difference. And the problem is, as you all know, from the Black Summer fires, that in the few months that we had of those fires, the carbon dioxide emissions from all that burnt forestry were greater than Australia's annual emissions that are officially counted. You don't count those emissions from burning forests. It's not part of official. So this, you can see where the problems we're at. And I'm going to quickly mention two of the other concerns of the conventional economic system. I'll now talk more about neoliberalism, which is a kind of an ideological outflow from neoclassical economic theory, if you can call it theory. And neoliberalism is based on free market capitalism, and it has the ideology that you leave everything to the market. Every major political decision should be done as a market decision. Small government, low taxes, you get the picture. You've heard it all before. The problem is that leaving things to the market is that the market's actually controlled by the 1%. It's not a free, unbiased system. Look at the power of Amazon, for example. The market also has failed dismally a number of times during global crises. It failed during the global financial crisis. Right? Governments had to intervene against the so-called principles of neoliberalism. They had to prop up the economies, prop up the banks. It failed during the COVID pandemic. Our government had to create and spend hundreds of billions of dollars to try and keep the economy going during COVID. A total violation of the principles, notions of neoliberalism. But don't worry, the government said, okay, we're doing this, but don't worry, we'll go back to the old economic system once we've got through COVID. We'll go back to neoliberalism. Well, okay, one more economic ideology. You've all heard this. Wealth trickles down from the rich to the poor. Well, there have been a number of studies now, and I came across a major study published last year, a study of 18 OECD countries spanning a period from 1965 to 50 years, a 50-year period. And they looked at all OECD countries in that period that gave tax cuts to the rich. They couldn't find any benefits from it in terms of employment or economic growth, if you believe economic growth is an important indicator. But they did find higher income inequality, of course. And here we are in Australia facing a proposal which is supported by both major political parties for tax cuts for the very rich. Okay, so what do we do about it? As I see it, most environmental campaigns tackle the impacts, and they perform a fantastic job. Without them, we would already have gone down the plug hole. So they deal with climate change and pollution and poverty and social injustice and ill health and so on. That's important. But we also have to tackle the driving forces. And I'm going to argue that the principal driving forces are state capture and another form of state capture, which is neoliberalism and the neoclassical economics so-called theory that supports it. We really need to devote more effort at this level. Now, of course, you could say there are more levels to go down. We go down, there's capitalism, there's autocracy, patriarchy, oligarchy, and underneath it all is the lust for power and wealth amongst many people. But I'm going to argue that, in fact, This is vulnerable and this is vulnerable. And there are ways of tackling both of them. But it does require a certain amount of organisation. It requires environmental, I'm probably talking initially of large organisations, environmental, social justice, peace, public health, trade union organisations, forming alliances to deal with state capture and to resist the economic ideologies. And really, when you think about it, it's not that hard. Because how is state capture implemented? Well, we've already discussed most of the tools used by powerful organisations. Political donations and election expenditure. Well now, our government is planning legislation, apparently in cahoots with the opposition, on election expenditure. But the way they are planning it is to make sure, from their point of view, that at the next election, no more Greens or Teal independents will be elected because they won't get election funding, according to what we are hearing about the draft legislation. So in other words, the election funding, if the government starts funding elections to a significant degree, will go to politicians who are already in office in the federal government. Now, with strong public resistance, that they may have to withdraw from that because once the message gets out. So this needs to be dealt with, but dealt with in a way that independents and others who are not members of the major political parties can get elected. The government apparently is saying, well, we're designing the legislation this way to keep people like Clive Palmer from influencing elections, and that would be a good thing. But clearly this needs to be rethought, the way they're doing it. Revolving door jobs can be controlled, and they are controlled in many other jurisdictions. Concentrated media ownership. We used to have laws limiting concentrated media ownership, but somehow they have disappeared. They can be restructured and replaced. Some countries have very strong laws, so it is possible. Social media campaigns, think tanks. Well, we need to call out bodies like the Institute of Public Affairs and the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. We need to call out the ABC if they treat such organisations as objective sources of information. We need to have a transparency in who our ministers and other politicians are officially meeting. We need to have politicians' diaries published. Now, fortunately, there's starting to be moves to tackle some of these things. And at the international level, we need really sovereign debt to be removed from the poorest countries, and for the less poorest, possibly converting the debts into grants, development grants, and so on. Trade dependence, military alliances, we need to examine. And all the actions on all these tools of state capture will strengthen democracy. Instead of having our decisions, the big decisions made by vested interests, sometimes dressing it up as a decision of the market. Okay, so you can see it's possible. Okay, all right. How do we implement it? Franklin D. Roosevelt is supposed to have said to a delegation that was lobbying him, "Okay, you convinced me. Now get out there and make me do it." And I think what he's saying is, build a social movement to make my decision credible as a politician. Politicians need to know that there is a movement, instead of responding just to very powerful vested interests to CEOs of very large corporations that can sometimes walk into a minister's office without an appointment even, as I'm told by some people. Now, local community action is really important, of course. It benefits community education, community empowerment, and you've already heard about some of the projects that are happening here under the Planetary Health Initiative, which is fantastic. But there are limitations. And the limitation is that, in fact, big government still holds most of the major decisions. Big government decides on infrastructure, on major roads, railways, water supply, sewerage, you name it. It decides on urban planning and land use planning. It decides on pollution control. It's energy efficiency standards for buildings, taxes, rules for banks and other financial institutions. The list goes on. So what I'm saying is local community action is necessary, but it's not sufficient unless that community action also translates into dealing with the larger system. In other words, and you've heard it all before, we need a system change as well. And I know Andrew Gaines has been saying that very firmly. A system change. And the challenge is to design a campaign to organise people and to bring organisations together so that they can exert very strong power at a political level and a social level. So that's really what we're suggesting. One of the key suggestions in the book is that we must form alliances. Individual groups, environmental or social justice or public health or peace, do not carry sufficient weight for a system change. And to get a system change, we have to bring groups together to cooperate, to allocate some of their time to the larger cause. And then you can get enormous pressure for social change. So, and that means pressure on state capture and on neoliberalism. And of course, as you know, there's a wide range of tactics, non-violent obstruction, and the challenge there is to annoy the government without annoying a large fraction of the population. So it is a challenge. If you stop the traffic in the main road, a lot of people are going to be annoyed, as we saw in Sydney on the approaches to the Sydney Harbour Tunnel. But non-violent obstruction has worked many times in the past. Strikes, boycotts, demonstrations. And of course the softer approaches also of public education, lobbying, media, and even legal actions. But legal actions against the government are very difficult to win. I was associated distantly with a group in Canberra that took legal action against a government that wanted to build a telecommunications tower in a nature reserve overlooking Canberra. The citizens, the good citizens, put a lot of time and effort in it, and they won the legal case. And the following day, the government passed legislation and built the tower. New legislation. So legal action is a bit tricky, but it can work. It has worked in the Netherlands, where the government was forced to take stronger action on climate change. The government lost the initial case, and then it appealed to a higher court, and the higher court, on different grounds, supported the environmental case. So you can win on legal grounds, but it is tricky. Some actions are going to be symbolic, but they can have powerful social impact. I'll be one of many people this weekend at Newcastle Harbour in my kayak, along with many other people, blocking the flow of coal ships. But it's a symbolic action. The same coal ships will still go out on Monday instead of on Saturday and Sunday. But if it gets a lot of media and brings together thousands of people, they won't all be out on the water, but they'll come together at the beach. It's part of building a resistance. So you can see we are now in a serious situation. We need to take radical action, non-violent action. Okay, we're nearly there. Now, are there any groups that have actually tried or are actually trying to bring together a whole range of different organisations to change, to get some sort of system change? And the answer is there are a few that I know of anyway. There's a group originally created in France, and I haven't written down the French thing, but the initials are ATAC, and it's translated as the International Association for the Taxation of Financial Transactions and Citizen Action. Now that might sound rather specialist, but it's not. They started by pushing for a tax on financial transaction, a Tobin tax, but they are now much broader than that. And they are basically against neoliberalism and for participatory democracy. So an interesting group and building strength. There's a World Social Forum which meets once every year to bring together what they call the global justice movement and to develop alternative futures. And their phrase is through championing of counter-hegemonic globalisation. But again, they're looking at whole system, large system response. In Australia, I'm very excited by a group called the Australian Democracy Network. They have been formed by an alliance between the Australian Conservation Foundation, the Australian Council of Social Services, and the Human Rights Law Centre. And they're just building up their staff and building up their strength. And they actually produced a superb report on state capture. It's one of the first things they ever did. So they're an exciting group to watch and perhaps even to support. Okay, nearly there. I think I'm probably running out of time, so what I'm going to do is skip and just simply say that we have alternative economic frameworks to neoclassical economics, conventional economics. We have ecological economics now, which is a transdisciplinary field. It contains economists, scientists, lawyers, sociologists, you name it. And they have developed quite a thriving field of work. And their main essence is that they put environmental sustainability and social justice before economic efficiency. Economic efficiency, of course, is the main goal, the main official goal of neoclassical economics. But some would say that their unofficial goal is to support capitalism and the rich. So, to transform the economic system, we need to also act both in terms of social justice and environment. And I'm just going to flag these because for social justice, see, people need to be motivated to support these big social system changes. So they need to be offered something. What are they going to get out of it? Well, the theory that is being developed is that they will get universal basic services. In other words, expanded public housing, public health, public education, public transport, childcare, aged care, national and local parks. And that might sound radical, but there are some countries that are already very, very close to achieving that, countries like the Scandinavian countries. And the idea is that if people have all these basics, then there's less drive for endless growth, less demand for more wealth, because they have a social wage, they have a security. And the other part of it is a job guarantee. So I'm just racing through. And a job guarantee involves the federal government paying a wage to everyone who wants to work, a basic wage to all who are unemployed and wish to work, unemployed in the market system. The jobs would be provided by all levels of government, especially local government, and also registered community organisations. Job guarantee is not work for the dole, because people can join it or leave it at will. They would still get the dole, whether they join it or not. But this would, and the advantage of a job guarantee over a universal basic income is that it's much less expensive for a start, and also it smooths the booms and busts of the normal, if I can call it, economic cycles. That we always go through recessions and then booms and then more recessions and so on. Well, the way the current economic system is that it just throws people out of work when they have a recession. But instead of having oscillations like that, with the job guarantee you have oscillations like this. During a recession, more people are employed under the job guarantee. During better economic times, many of those people move into the market economy, if that's where they want to go. Anyway, so I'll skip that. We can talk about war if you want to. And I guess to close, so there are ways forward. The systems seem to be complex, but they're not that complex. The challenge is organisation. As the trade union movement knows, the key person in a trade union is the organiser, the person who brings together people on to struggle for a particular cause. The strength of the community is its numbers, but it's only strong if those numbers are organised and can work together on issues. The strength of those who, the 1%, they're very low in numbers, but they have lots of wealth and hence lots of political power. So the way forward, I would argue, is to build the strength of the community through organisation and alliances between organisations, to apply very strong pressure on decision makers, whether they're politicians or big business or whatever. There is a way forward, but time is running out and we really have to struggle. So thank you for your attention, and I'll try and answer questions. So a country that is monetary sovereign has its own currency and isn't highly dependent upon overseas currencies like the US dollar. And such a country like Australia or the United States or Japan or China can and does all the time create money. It's dressed up as selling, buying bonds or something, but in fact it doesn't. With bonds, the government has to pay interest, and the reality is it can just create money, provided when that money is spent, the spending is within the capacity of the economy. If it isn't within the capacity of the economy, in other words, if you don't have the labour force or the technologies or the raw materials or the infrastructure, then prices are going to get pushed up. You will get inflation. But the Australian government, as I mentioned before, during COVID, created, I think it was about $300 or $400 billion, just like that. It didn't actually create any inflation at the time. But we have to be careful. the theory behind this is called modern monetary theory. The theory says very clearly that you can only create within the economic capacity of the country, and otherwise you create inflation. So it's not a magic pudding. And when I discussed this with John Quiggin, he was very dismissive. He said, Australia's got full employment and all that. We can't create more money. But when I thought about it afterwards, in fact, employment in Australia can be 1 hour a week's work. And there's a lot of people, we now know, that are underemployed. There are also a lot of people employed in what I would call destructive or useless areas. And either through gentle means like taxation or less gentle means like regulation, we can limit the jobs. We certainly need to do something to reduce the power of the financial services industry, which is bigger than the whole economy. So certainly within, and also the other thing is that if governments create money and spend it, they can also spend it in ways to increase the economic capacity of the country, like improving infrastructure, for example, which is not necessarily inflationary at all, but enables the economy to function better. So the book discusses that. It introduces it in fairly, I hope, simple and clear terms. There are books like Stephanie Kelton's book, which explains modern monetary theory in a lot more detail, but still in a way that's comprehensible. And there are quite difficult textbooks that I'm still wrestling with, which provide a solid basis for that. And the other thing that John Quiggin said was, of course, that people know, economists know all this. They just won't admit it publicly, most of them. And so Quiggin's attitude was, well, modern monetary theory is just Keynesian economics, boosted up a bit. And there's elements of truth, I believe, in that. But economists won't tell us the truth. And politicians won't, because if people said, well, why do we have such a housing shortage? Why aren't we spending more on protecting the environment? We could do that with clever creation of money and clever spending of it. Then politicians and governments would look very bad. Well, universal basic income is universal, so the rich get it as well as the poor. And it goes to everyone. Presumably, there's no dole then. And the question is, at what level can you create a universal basic income? And it turns out that, realistically, it would be very low, and most people wouldn't be able to survive on it. The advantage of a job guarantee is that it's targeted. It's targeted to people who are unemployed and want to work. And if you actually do the sums, it works out as cheaper. It has all the benefits of a universal basic income, as far as I can see. It's less expensive, and it has the additional benefit that I mentioned of a macroeconomic benefit of smoothing the boom-bust cycles. Incidentally, the boom-bust cycles, for those who have got a mathematical interest, is a clear indication that the economic system is not what we call a linear system. It's not something where you make a small deviation from equilibrium and will return to equilibrium. These big cycles show that it is a non-linear system. It goes through tipping points. And yet most economics theory, almost all economics theory, assumes that you have a system in equilibrium with small deviations from equilibrium. This is a bit of an aside. It's absolute nonsense to anyone who's got mathematical, scientific background. You look at the macroeconomic behaviour of systems, and you say, oh, that's a non-linear system. That's not a system that returns to equilibrium. And yet we have these very restricted tools, like the only way of handling inflation at present in this country is raising interest rates all the time. And it doesn't matter if the inflation is partially caused by events outside this country or by profiteers inside the country. The answer is to raise interest rates. It's very destructive. Throws people out of work and out of houses. We do discuss a circular economy, and we conclude in the book that we can have what we call a leaky circular economy. Fully circular economy, we believe, is impossible.
Yeah, that's true.
And a leaky circular economy is one where some things, unfortunately, get lost into the environment. And they are extremely difficult to get back. Maybe in future we'll find some way of extracting phosphorus from seawater, because that's where it's going, off the land, superphosphate, through our toilets. It ends up in the sea at very low density. Maybe someone will invent some technology that grabs that very low density phosphorus, but I doubt it. It's a problem of entropy, if you like.
Yes.
Entropy increases. So I would say we must do everything we can to go as close as possible to a circular economy, but some things we're going to lose. And when we got to the stage where we thought, well, look, we're really concerned that we want our civilization not to collapse over this century, but perhaps to last a few millennia. That would be nice. And that would be, but the idea that we could last for billions of years until the sun engulfs the earth, at present it's not looking good, and at present it's not looking good getting to the end of the century. Now, we also have debates with people who say, look, the earth is doomed, civilization is doomed, we have to plan how to rebuild from complete disaster. Our book does not go there. We don't want to go there because my vision of complete disaster will inevitably contain the Mad Max scenario. Small, isolated communities, some of them pirates. It's because the problem is overpopulation. So anyway, getting back to your point, we talk about leaky circular economy, and we'd be delighted if we could go for several thousand years. That would be a start, and maybe we'll learn some way of existing without having a coupling between economic activity and environmental impact. But at present, while we, on a local scale, for short periods of time, we can sometimes decouple. In an absolute sense, it doesn't look good. Even with renewable energy and a lot of other technological advances, we can do a lot better. We can go from a century to thousands of years. And that's a start. I would always place the emphasis on solutions, and that's what we're trying to do in the book. We have to be careful not to blame individuals who are embedded in a system that makes it very difficult. I had to drive here. If I'd had more time, I would have taken a train, and there would have been 2 trains and twice as long, 3 times as long to get here. And it's so easy to blame individuals when they're embedded in a system that doesn't give them a lot of choices. People who are living in rental accommodation don't have a lot of choice about saving energy unless we pass regulations that require landladies and landlords to meet basic energy consumption standards in the building. And in fact, the ACT is planning that. The ACT already, if you sell a house in the ACT, and I did once, many years ago, you have to have an energy audit. And the results of that energy audit have to go on the sales document. And now they want to do that with rental accommodation. This has been going for 20 years, more. Not one other place in the whole of Australia has that requirement. It is so obvious. It works. It not only does it make buildings more energy efficient, but it trains a whole bunch of people in energy auditing. So I would say that's why I'm focusing on changing the system. People don't have choices. People who live on the fringe of the city where there's no public transport have to drive their cars. So we have to change the system.
Yeah.
But this culture of waste is new. It's not something that's in our genes. When I was a young child, I still remember my father going out after the horse-drawn baker or dairy vehicle, the milk delivery, with a shovel, picking up the manure and putting it on the garden to grow the vegetables. And that wasn't rare. Everyone did it. So there's been a conditioning of the population towards consumption and waste, and that can be reversed. It's not irreversible, but it does require organisation, and it can't be done just by telling individuals, oh, you've got to do this or you've got to do that. You've got to change the system and make it desirable. And that's why we're emphasising universal basic services, because it'll give the vast majority of people, hopefully, a better system, better life to build upon. I mean, you know, you just take the housing situation in this country alone, it's utterly disgraceful. I like all of them except one, because I think it's goal number 8 assumes basically we have to have continued economic growth. And then I'm disappointed at the missing goal. There is no mention of population. Now, at one conceptual level, you can argue that the drivers of environmental destruction are population, consumption per person, and technological impact. And most of the focus has been on technology. A lot of the discussion this evening has been about consumption per person. Population is part of it. Because when you actually look at the impacts, consumption per person has a bigger impact than population growth. Now, population is a very difficult issue to discuss because people get confused. They confuse it with racism, which has got nothing to do with it. And in Glenn Albrecht's meeting, which I listened to the other day, there was some discussion amongst the audience about that. My main concern about population is the population in the rich countries, because every additional Australian on average, is going to have a much bigger impact than an additional person almost anywhere else in the world, because of our very high environmental impacts, especially we're one of the world's biggest greenhouse gas emissions per person on average. Of course, averages are misleading because there are big differences in the community. Oil is to a large degree used for transportation, and I see a very rapid transition to electric vehicles, and of course improved public transport and facilities for cycling and walking within local areas. And this is accelerating, particularly overseas, but even in Australia. So overseas, in Norway, almost all new cars are now electric, with some very simple policies. In Australia, it's taken a while because the government's been reluctant to apply fuel efficiency standards for motor vehicle fleets, which is one of the policy drivers in Europe. But in 2022, 2.2%, if I remember the figures correctly, 2.2% of new cars were electric. In 2023, up to November, 4.8% of new cars were electric. And once, I think we'll see some very rapid drops in the cost of batteries for electric vehicles, which is the main problem in the upfront cost. And when that happens, probably within the next 5 years, we'll see a huge rapid shift. So I think in transportation, use of oil will go down dramatically by 2030. Now, oil, as you know, is also used to make clothes, to make all sorts of things. Some of that can be substituted with organic material, but I don't claim expertise in that area, and I'm really just focused on the energy. But oil is on the way out, and as you said, it's not only getting more expensive to extract, but you need to put more and more energy in to get the energy out. And you know, a lot of the oil fields now are underwater, and well, we saw one disaster off the coast of the US a few years ago when that went wrong. So I'm not so worried about oil. I think that'll go. I think one of the coal is on the way out. You know, it's uneven across the world, but it's very unlikely we'll ever see a coal-fired power station again in this country. They're just too expensive compared with wind and solar, even in the battery storage. Combustion heating is an issue. Most combustion heating in Australia is done with what the propaganda calls natural gas, but I think we should be calling fossil gas. We're starting to see moves in Victoria, because Victoria has a huge dependence on fossil gas for combustion heating and hot water and everything. But the current government is moving in that direction. But people are going to need incentives to replace combustion heating with electric heat pumps, which are far more efficient. So one of the beauties, I mean, this comes back to degrowth, that one of the beauties of transitioning to electric transport and electric heating is that the amount of energy required goes down significantly. So for example, an internal combustion engine car, if it's petrol, you're lucky to get 20% energy conversion efficiency. In other words, you're likely to get 20% of the energy in the fuel used to actually drive the car. Most of it is waste heat. With an electric vehicle, maybe 85% of the electrical energy in your battery is going to drive the car. So, provided overall consumption doesn't keep growing, there's an opportunity for degrowth, if I can use that dirty word, towards a steady state economy in the transport area. It's the same with combustion heating. If you use a heat pump, you basically, you get about, depending on the heat pump, you might get 3 to 5 times the amount of energy out that you actually put in. Now that doesn't violate the law of conservation energy, because the energy you put in is not converted into heat. It's used to pump heat, if you're heating your house, from outside into the house, or if you're a refrigerator, it's used to pump heat from inside the fridge out the pipes at the back of the fridge. So that's huge efficiency gains again. So potentially, we could have some degrowth in the energy area without even trying, once we electrify our heating and transportation. But the trouble is, we've still got to deal with this growing consumption, which could wipe out that advantage. But there are some real advantages. Aviation is one of the difficult areas. Some airlines, including Qantas, are putting some biofuels in, usually in one of the engines, without telling the passengers, as part of getting some experience So biofuels is one of the pathways, but then we have environmental limits on how much biofuel we can produce. So my feeling is that ultimately we need to have to use renewable energy to split water to produce hydrogen and oxygen. And then if the hydrogen is too difficult to manage, because it is a difficult fuel to manage, combine it with nitrogen from the air to form ammonia, which is a fuel that does not emit carbon dioxide when it's combusted. So that's one of the pathways that's being looked at for the longer term for long-distance aviation. For short-distance aviation, there's a number of options. There are some commercial electric planes on the market now for short hops, a few hundred kilometres, for relatively small numbers of passengers. But for longer distances, the batteries would become too heavy, and so that's not likely. The growth for transport on the ground, high-speed rail, provided those trains are full, is highly energy efficient. And it's very sad that in Australia we don't have high-speed rail between Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney and Brisbane. The Melbourne-Sydney air route is one of the busiest in the world. I think it's number 3 in the whole world. And it would be wonderful to replace at least half of that air traffic with a high-speed rail, but it never seems to get off the ground. or on the ground. What's happening in China is very high-speed rail is going in everywhere. I mean, they know what works, and but basically for international air travel, I think hydrogen is the future, but we're not there yet. Renewable energy occupies very little land. The opponents of wind power, let's start with wind and then talk about solar. Opponents of wind power will say, look at the huge areas that wind farms occupy. In fact, they don't occupy 98% of those areas on average. They span those areas. Farming country, usually farming country, farming continues between the wind turbines. The only land occupied is by the turbines, the substation and the access roads. So typically 2% of the land is actually occupied. And a wind farm or a series of wind farms occupy less land than equivalent coal-fired power stations with open-cut coal mines. Okay? Now, solar. Large-scale solar does occupy quite a lot of land, and what's happening now is that on agricultural land, they are lifting them up a bit higher so that sheep can graze underneath. In China, they're raising them a lot higher so that wheat and corn and barley and rice can be grown and harvested. Now, obviously, putting them up on poles increases the costs, but in some cases, and it's early days, if you work out the multiple benefits of having 2 crops, an energy crop and an organic crop that's grown, it comes out well economically. But certainly what they're finding is that with sheep, their productivity is actually increased because they have the shade underneath the solar panels. Now, of course, in Australia, a large part of our solar is on rooftops, and that occupies no land. We're starting to see more solar farms on bodies of water, and we have some in Australia, floating solar farms. And they particularly can play a role in countries that have very little land area, like Hong Kong, not really a country, but it has a large area of water that is not too stormy. And solar farms are going in on water storages and lakes all over the place. And that having floating solar actually improves the efficiency of the solar system because it cools the solar collectors. If solar collectors are too hot, they become less efficient. So that's one issue. Now, what was your second? Oh, nuclear power. Okay, look, I'm not a fan of nuclear power. It is vastly more expensive than wind and solar. It is dangerous.
Are you talking about the fast-breed reactors, or are you talking about the more modern thorium reactors that are currently?
I'm talking about all existing reactors, and there's a lot of hype about reactors that haven't been built. And quite honestly, we're a long way from seeing them. The main hype is actually for small modular reactors. They do not exist. They are paper reactors fueled on ink. And there are a few small reactors. Nuclear submarines, nuclear-powered submarines have small reactors, but they're not modular. They're incredibly expensive. They cannot be mass-produced. Russia has 2 ships powered by nuclear reactors. Again, those reactors are incredibly expensive. They cannot be mass-produced. If they can't be mass-produced, they're going to provide electricity or heat or whatever you want, even more expensive than from existing nuclear reactors, which are sort of typically 5 times the electricity cost of solar now, large-scale solar. So there are other concerns about. Let me tell you a story. The tsunami that swept across the east coast of Japan and destroyed the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, it caused a meltdown in 3 of their 6 reactors. It was quite devastating, and it's devastated the fishing and agricultural industries and so on. 80 kilometres to the south of Fukushima is a town called Kamizu. Kamizu has a wind farm in the surf. It's called a near-shore wind farm. The tsunami broke, the wave broke and went straight through the wind farm. The wind farm continued to operate until the grid went down. And when the grid was restored, the wind farm recommenced operations. But fortunately, the tsunami wave wasn't quite high enough to hit the blades of the wind turbines. Now, hardly anyone has publicised that. One wonders why. But the fact is, even in the surf, where the wave was breaking, this huge tsunami wave was breaking, the wind farm survived. Now that's just the story, but look, the other concern about nuclear reactors is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And a number of countries have used nuclear power as a cloak to produce nuclear weapons. The United Kingdom used the first generation of nuclear power stations to produce additional plutonium to supplement their military reactor plutonium for nuclear weapons. In France, the civil and military nuclear industries are indistinguishable. They use the same facilities. India, Pakistan and North Korea all proliferated, created nuclear weapons from the so-called peaceful nuclear fuel cycle. So did South Africa. A number of other countries have attempted to create nuclear weapons from so-called peaceful nuclear power. They include Australia in the 1960s under the Gorton government. And we now know that the purpose of the proposed nuclear power station that they actually built the foundations for at Jervis Bay was to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. Fortunately, that project was terminated by change of Prime Minister. Gorton was replaced, I think, by Billy McMahon, who wasn't so enthusiastic. But many other countries, Taiwan, South Korea, Brazil, Argentina, all tried to use the peaceful nuclear fuel cycle to produce nuclear weapons, but fortunately didn't take that to completion. So part of my recommendations for reducing the risk of nuclear war is to put all facilities around the world that produce enriched uranium or reprocess the spent fuel of nuclear reactors under complete international control. Of course, our friends in the United States and Russia and China will not agree to that. But it's a logical, sensible thing to do, because several countries have produced nuclear weapons either by excessively enriching uranium or by extracting the plutonium from the spent fuel. That you wouldn't actually want to use all that solar, because there is also a need for more concentrated solar sources from solar power stations for industries and for dense populations. So we will need a combination. Absolutely. But it's true, there is a huge potential still for rooftop solar, and it's increased recently because many roofs cannot hold the weight of conventional solar panels, and there are now some new lightweight solar panels are coming onto the market, which will be suitable for warehouses and other places that haven't been designed to support any weight. It's pretty well established that if you eat less meat, especially cows and sheep, you'll reduce your climate impact quite considerably. And there are other benefits too, but we haven't really discussed them. We have got a small section on food in the book, but George Monbiot has written a book about that recently that I'm keen to read. That capitalism and the neoclassical economic system has pushed individualism to an absurd state, but some cultures have been able to resist that much better. South Korea, I'd say also China, except that they are throwing away a lot of their resistance as far as I can see. So, for example, they've taken up capitalism really in quite a big way. It's state capitalism, so the big business is to some extent controlled by the state, but they've gone away from free schooling, for example. Parents have to pay to have their kids schooled. A lot of the communist principles have been lost. And personally, I don't, and I've travelled and worked in China for a while, I don't see China as a communist country anymore. And I hope I don't offend any Chinese people here, but I see it as a state capitalist country ruled by one party. And that party is doing some good things for the people. It's had some real economic successes, but it's got all the problems of pushing individualism. Families used to, as I understand it, families used to be very close and look after their members in China. Now the young people are not caring about looking after the parents when they get old and so on. It's all changing. And I would say that's partly, to a large degree, due to the adoption of capitalism in China. But so it's great that there are societies that have resisted that to some degree, and we can resist it again. Yes. Well, we have to change the system.
Yes.
But the thing is that we have to start with achievable goals. And with the economic system, for example, I'm arguing that it would be a big ask to overthrow capitalism within a few years. But what we can overthrow is neoliberalism. It has failed again and again. It just needs a big push, honestly. And you know, some of us are trying. So, for example, I'm fortunate to be a member of an international group of scientists and economists who have a research project on really looking at the scientific basis of macroeconomics, economics of countries. And what we're finding in the work is that there is no scientific basis for it at all. Economics, macroeconomics, is not a science. And we're just trying to publish it now, which is more difficult in a reputable journal. And then if we get that published, we can use that to apply some pressure in the wider community.